Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. This is our first Inclusion Consortium. We will give a couple minutes for everyone to join us. I know we're all getting in between meetings. A few housekeeping items. We will follow up with everyone with a recording of today's session. And if you have any questions throughout today's presentation, please type them into the chat box. I will save them for the end, and our speakers will make sure that we have time to get to them. So without further ado, let's kick it off. Welcome, Lauren and Bernardo.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lindsay. Hi, everybody. This is Lauren Franklin. We'll jump into intros shortly, but just to give you a little bit of background on what the Inclusion Consortium is. So we've been hearing at Limeade that diversity and inclusion thought leaders are looking for a place to connect and learn new ideas. So that's what this is. This is really a forum to learn new ideas for making diversity and inclusion come to life at your organization and connect with others and connect with experts in this space. So today we're focusing on measuring inclusion, and we're going to be talking about a couple key things. Of course, we'll introduce our guests for today, and then we're going to jump into the importance of inclusion, how we measure it, and then give you a couple of tangible ideas for how to present this to your executive team and some takeaways. And then, like Lindsay mentioned, we have plenty of time for question and answers, so we can make sure we can leave you with some ideas you can go make come to life today. So without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Bernardo Ferdman. Dr. Bernardo Ferdman and I met at SIOP, which is an industrial organizational psychology conference this spring, and just had an incredible conversation around the true meaning of inclusion, and sometimes it's paradoxes that come out, and our passions for this, and it just sparked an interest to collaborate further. He's been researching inclusion for 30 years, so we truly have the best of the best with us today when it comes to researching and understanding inclusion. So with that, I'll pass to Bernardo to say a couple of things about himself.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's wonderful to be here with you. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Limeade, for hosting me here in beautiful, rainy Bellevue, Washington. I live in San Diego, California, so it's a nice change of pace being here. I am really thrilled to be here. As Lauren said, we really had a wonderful conversation and have continued talking about inclusion. It's so important that we all dialogue about this and think about all our different perspectives on this really important topic. I've been working in it for many years. My passion is creating a better and more just world, and better and more just organizations where more of us can bring our strengths, our passions, our interests, ourselves, our full selves to work in ways that where we don't have to hide or cover valued identities, things that really make us who we are and make us stronger. I'm originally from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I grew up there, in New York City, in Puerto Rico. My background is in psychology. My PhD is in psychology. I've been a professor for almost over 31 years, and a couple of years ago, I moved into full-time practice. I've been doing practice all along, so I'm really excited about that. I've done research, scholarship, practice, and really my expertise and focus is inclusion, what it is, how to foster it, how to measure it, how we can get more of it for more of us. I recently created a Inclusion at Work, which is a digital coaching platform for learning about inclusion and also the Inclusion at Work assessment, and we can say more about that later. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about how to measure inclusion and why it matters.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bernardo. And for those of you on the phone, my name is Lauren Franklin. I am the brand manager for our inclusion solution at Limeade. Really what that means is I get to learn about diversity and inclusion day in and day out, so pretty much a dream job, and use that information and take it back to our company to work on our internal diversity and inclusion initiatives, as well as make our solution the best that it can be for all of our customers. So without further ado, let's get into the content. A couple things we wanted to learn from you actually before we really dig into how to measure inclusion is a little bit about your role in owning diversity and inclusion. So we have a poll question here for you, and we would just want to understand, is it your primary responsibility? Is it one among many for you? Is it just a side project, or are you just here to learn today and you're not responsible for it at all? So just take a couple minutes and share with us around your responsibility for diversity and inclusion. And then we have one more poll for you afterwards. So we'll give people a couple seconds. All right, we see responses coming in. All right, so we see that we've got, oh my gosh, probably almost 90% of you are owning some aspect of diversity inclusion at your organization, with 44% as the primary responsibility, and then many of you wearing multiple hats when it comes to this. So thank you so much. That gives us a great sense of who's on the phone today. So our next poll is around what you're doing right now to measure inclusion. So we're hoping to get an understanding of, is this something you're currently working on, you want to work on, so if you take a couple minutes to answer that, then we'll report back.
Yeah, this is, it's great to see that we're with a group of people who really are so involved in this area. I wanted to call out, as you're answering the question, my project associate at Ferdman Consulting, Sophia Sung, who is on the call listening in. She's really worked with me a lot in the last couple of years on developing our measures and really making them work better. So thanks, Sophia.
Awesome. All right, so we see that about 40% of you currently are measuring inclusion. That's fantastic. We love to see that. But also almost half of you are not currently doing it but want to do it in the near future. So that's great. You're in the right place because that's what we're going to talk about. All right, so polls are closed. So let's jump into, before we talk about measuring inclusion, what we're even talking about. What is the definition of inclusion? So at Limeade, we define inclusion as a sense of belonging, connection, and community. And we believe that inclusive organizations are those that help people feel that every day. They feel welcome, known, and valued for who they truly are. When we think about inclusion in the context of diversity and belonging, we often hear these terms put together, sometimes called DIBS for short. We really think of inclusion as kind of the driver of action. I like to put it as inclusion as the verb. We see that when that act of inclusion is fully realized, that's when you can reap the benefits of diversity. So when people both feel that they're unique and they're bringing that unique identity to work, but they also feel that sense of belonging to a group, that's kind of the secret magic of inclusion, and that kind of continual reinforcement of, I am who I am, but I also feel like I matter, a part of this community. So Bernardo, tell me a little bit more about your definition. I loved reading this before we started today, but what does this mean to you? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, sure. I love how you put it, Lauren. It's beautiful. And I love that you added the part about uniqueness and diversity, because I think that's the key. Because many of us have had experience with inclusion in homogeneous situations. The key is doing it in the context where there is diversity. So a key part for me is that inclusion is active, as you mentioned, and it's where in different levels, whether it's individuals, groups, organizations, and societies, instead of trying to make all of us the same, instead of trying to be homogeneous, we see and approach diversity as a valued resource. It's something that can give us benefits, as you mentioned. And in an inclusive system, whether it's a group, an organization, a society, we value ourselves and others not because of our similarities, but we value each other because of our differences. The differences are not a problem, but rather a resource and a benefit. So in that context, everyone should be empowered to be a full participant and contributor. That's what belonging means for me. It's not just, hey, I belong, but under what conditions? Can I be fully myself? Can I feel and be connected to the larger collective without having to give up that sense of uniqueness, that sense of self, that sense of cherished identities or vital qualities? When I was going to come here, I asked you, hey, how do people dress at Limeade? And you said, come as you are. And that's just been resonating for me, because that's such a beautiful summary of what I just said. Come as you are and bring your strength so that we can do something better together with all of us as we are. That's not a simple thing, and I'll say a little bit more about that. I think there's some key elements of inclusion. First of all, it means changing how we interact. We're very used to doing things in homogeneous contexts, and we must learn and do active things to be able to work across differences more effectively. So we have to be able to leverage and integrate those differences in a more productive, authentic, and effective way. We have to disrupt patterns of social inequality. We know that there's ways that groups are organized in societies and different communities in ways where some groups have more power than others. And we see that recently in some very powerful ways, and we need to change that. Equity is very much part of this conversation and needs to be more and more there. And so we need to foster more equity, participation, and belonging, not just belonging, while we support people and groups and collectives growing and determining their own futures. And that enhances mutual benefit. It's really about getting benefits for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the challenge of inclusion is how much, in what ways, and how well do organizations and their people fully connect with, engage with, use, or benefit from, and truly empower people across different types of differences. As a psychologist originally, my perspective is that we need to focus on the experience, what I call the experience of inclusion. Martin Davidson and I came up with this term in about 20 years ago. And the idea is, am I and are we as a particular social group safe, trusted, accepted? Are we respected and supported? Do we feel valued, fulfilled, engaged? Are we able to be authentic in this group or organization? Do I feel that I am growing into my best self without losing or compromising important aspects of who I am? And I need to have this experience not just as an individual, but as a member of many, many different social identity groups. So are other people like me experiencing this? If I see other people who are like me, Latino or Jewish or man or whatever my identities are, feeling not included, then I'm going to have less experience of inclusion, I would argue. And that to me is at the core of what inclusion is and what we're striving for, and later as we talk about when we measure it as well.
Yeah, I really appreciated the nuances you added in that definition and the conversations we've had around this. And I think oftentimes some of the interventions we've seen in companies are really focused maybe on one identity. Like I know at Lyme we have a women in the workplace group, which we've loved and has brought so many meaningful conversations, but it's just focusing on one identity. So how do we think about the multiple identities that people can hold and how that impacts their feelings of inclusion? So let's transition a little bit into measuring inclusion. Actually, do you want to talk a little bit about this piece?
Yeah, I do, because I think that's another important thing to highlight. And you mentioned paradoxes before. This is one of the paradoxes of inclusion, is that implicit in our definitions that we've just said is that we really want to create a sense of safety and participation and belonging, and especially comfort for more people. Many people have not felt at ease in the workplace when they come from marginalized identities or identities that are different or different experiences or styles or whatever it is. And so we're trying to increase that. The paradox is that the more that we do that, the more that we will encounter difference in the workplace, because we're making it safe for those differences. There'll be more and more uniqueness. Everybody's going to be unique, and we'll even see different people as quote unquote deviant, and not in the moral sense, but in a statistical sense. So it means that more of us have to be able to be uncomfortable. We will experience more discomfort as a natural byproduct of the increasing comfort of difference being present. So it's about holding both of those present, and it's an active balancing process of holding these two opposites and seeing that they're both part and parcel of the same dynamic.
Yeah. So when I see this slide, this really, to me, illustrates why it's hard to measure inclusion, that it is
That's
kind
right.
of these paradoxes happening at the same time, and I think this visual puts it well. So
That's right.
help us understand this a little bit better. Why does this really matter in measuring inclusion? What's so important for, those 50% of the people on the phone that said that they are not measuring it, but they want to? Why is this so critical to be thinking about now?
Well, it's important because we have to understand where we are in this process. And I want to explain what I mean by the practice of inclusion to expand on that. I mentioned a moment ago the experience of inclusion that we can experience at the individual level, or we can analyze it at the level of a whole group, of a social identity group. I believe that what stimulates that and what it leads to is more inclusive values, policies, practices, and behaviors at different levels of analysis, either at a societal level, in organizations, at the leadership level, for work groups, and even for individuals. I found in some of my research that people who said they experienced more inclusion also report that they behave more inclusively. They report more inclusive behavior on the part of their colleagues. So which leads to what? I don't know. I like to think about it as a virtuous cycle where the two things build on each other. And so in terms of why we want to measure, we want to be able to take the pulse in all of those locations, at the experience of inclusion and in terms of the systems and policies and practices and behaviors that ideally drive inclusion and also come from more experiences of inclusion. You can look at this in this slide in a slightly different way when we break apart the different levels. And this is what I call my multi-level systems framework for inclusion. I first wrote about it more widely in my book that I had the image of earlier, Diversity at Work, the Practice of Inclusion, which brings together expertise of 30 plus authors from around the world to see what we really know about inclusion from a research-based perspective. And in my introductory chapter, I proposed this model where the experience of inclusion is at the grounding for it. It's what I talked about earlier. And the idea is that that's what we're hoping for. I don't think you can say we have inclusion if we don't have people experiencing inclusion. However, we also have to think about what's happening at every other level of this framework. People behave inclusively. So, for example, saying hello, acknowledging other people, connecting with people. We can measure or think about that. We can look at what's happening in groups and teams. What kind of norms are there? Are there practices for checking in, for making sure that everybody has the information they need, for working through differences in a constructive and positive way where people really can bring in their voices and also allow for conflicts, which are very much part and parcel of inclusion. And so the skills that are needed for that can also be described and measured. What's happening at the leadership level? What kind of competency models are there that include skills and practices for inclusion? What behaviors are leaders doing that, in a sense, magnify effects up and down this framework from macro to micro and from micro to macro? And then what's happening in the organization? What are the policies and practices? What is the climate like around inclusion? And this means analyzing systems like the talent management systems, for example, the HR policies, our marketing policies or approaches, our supplier chain, all of those things. And then what's the societal context? This is less likely to be measured in organizations, but we have to understand, depends what country or society we're in. What are the norms there? What are the beliefs and values that people bring in from the outside world and that they take back to that world? And so the organization is interacting with its communities, and that's important. And all of these effects go up and down the system. So I think when we talk about inclusion and we want to measure it, we need to be thinking about which of these levels and not look at one to the exclusion of the other. We really need to think about which of these matter to us, and I would argue ultimately, how do we build more experiences of inclusion across many different kinds of people?
Yeah, that's a great takeaway.
So the other reason why it's so important to measure inclusion in this context is that it's an intervention. It really supports an inclusion and diversity and equity initiative. For example, it's going to clarify goals and how we are going to achieve them. So if you're measuring inclusion at those different levels I just talked about, then we can think about where are we trying to go in each of those levels and why. And then we can talk about, in the measure, the metrics will include process measures to think about how we're doing it. What are the behaviors that people are trying to do? How much of that are we seeing? What are the competencies that everyone needs, that leaders need, and so on? So it's going to focus our effort, right? We know what we're going to try to get what we measure, right? And so by looking at what we're doing, we're going to try to get those desired positive outcomes. And of course, we're going to be able to see change over time. If we have these measures at different times, then we can see, great, we're doing better, or we're going to focus our effort in this particular area. And also, in this field, in any organizational situation, we have certain assumptions and hypotheses, and by measuring, we can test them. We can have some evidence base for our work. And also, a really critical idea is that oftentimes when we're working in this field, people are just focusing a lot on representation. How many of this group, how many of that group? And by trying to broaden our view of inclusion, create metrics for all the different levels, and measuring it, we're going to be moving beyond representation. As important as that is, it's certainly insufficient.
Yeah, and I think that I like this, that it's an intervention, and I get a lot of questions around, where do I start? What should I do first? Especially for people where this is one of many hats that they wear and maybe sometimes comes second or third on the priority list. I think this is a really great takeaway to think about. Just starting to measure it is a good action to take.
That's right. It's in itself a way for people to understand as a baseline where we are. It's not enough to measure if you're not prepared to do something with it going forward, right? That could be counterproductive. However, you don't have to wait until late in an initiative to measure. I would argue that it's important to do it early rather than late.
I would agree with that. And what we see at Limeade, we often talk about is that this is becoming increasingly important for companies to think about. And we don't think that this is going to change anytime soon. We see that boards and CEOs and executives across the board are really seeing that this is important for their organizations and are asking to see some of that data and those numbers behind inclusion in their organizations. So we know that millennials really care about this. Millennials are going to make up 75% of the workforce by 2025. So this is going to become increasingly important for organizations to think about with attracting talent. So not only is it important when we think about just taking that first step towards action, but it's critical for the success of companies, I would argue, in many ways, and is going to continue to be that way. We've also seen the impact on different people results at Limeade. This is some of the research that we found last year, is that individuals who feel included at work, they're more engaged. They want to stay longer at their organizations, they have greater well-being, and they're more likely to recommend that organization. So I think you're pointing out the importance of measuring inclusion from that societal level and measuring it across the organization is a great action to take. And I think we echo that and also see that there's people impacts too, and impacts on their work and how they show up, as well as for that business itself.
So before you go forward, I want to comment on this. I think what you said is so important. What this slide shows to me is the power of measurement. It's not just measuring inclusion, but it's being able to relate, however we're defining and measuring it, to other kinds of outcomes and indicators. So that's what this slide to me represents. You cannot do that if you're not measuring inclusion as well as these other aspects: turnover, intentions, recommendations, general well-being, and so on, right? So that's why it's so important, because we can really assess what it's doing for us.
Exactly. So let's get a little bit more specific. I think a couple things that I've learned in our conversation so far is that there's paradoxes within inclusion, right? We're looking at not only is it about difference and unique identity, but it's about belonging and being able to feel like you're a part of something. We also have the paradox that you brought up, is that as you increase that diversity and focus on that discomfort can increase, and how does measuring inclusion play a role in that? So let's get into the specifics of how do we actually measure this?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to answer that by giving you a case study briefly, because I think there's not one magic answer. I think many people I'm sure when people register for this, they said, great, you're going to give me the turnkey aspect to measuring inclusion. I have news. You can do that. There are measures. Limeade has some. Ferdman Consulting has a measure. The key, though, is how it's used. It has to be part of an overall plan and intervention, and ideally, right? I mean, or you can use it and then decide to do the intervention, but there isn't some kind of magic answer. It could be part of a broader organization development work, ideally. So in this particular example, I worked with a global manufacturing organization a number of years ago. They were interested in creating an inclusion survey, a global one, for their whole organization across multiple countries, 5,000 people around the world. And they agreed that we should take a positive and proactive approach, in the sense that a lot of times people think, let's measure inclusion, and they want to measure exclusion. I think exclusion is different. Discrimination, bias, and so on are not the opposite of inclusion. In other words, if we eliminate bias, that doesn't mean that we have inclusion. If we eliminate discrimination, it doesn't mean we have inclusion. Inclusion, I think of as a proactive process. And so that was the first part. And also it was a way to reduce the defensiveness that might be engendered by that kind of survey, by a more negative one. And we used constructs and items that were consistent with and reflective of key statements in the organization and the values. For example, customer service, leadership, fairness, respect, collaboration, valuing diversity. These were things the organization was saying are important, and the items and the constructs reflected that. We focused on what I mentioned earlier, the individual experience of inclusion as a basis to construct a core inclusion index. That was going to be our indicator of the amount of inclusion. And then we had items and constructs that were meaningful in the company, but also conceptually grounded. In other words, they reflected best practices and expert knowledge. So I was responsible to generate the constructs and to support the item generation, but the organization owned the items in this case. They didn't want to use my pre-existing measure. They wanted one that they owned, but they also, I also worked with other colleagues who were experts in the field to check what the constructs we were using are against the literature, against best practices, against the research.
Hey, Bernardo,
Yeah.
quick question. This is for my own learning too. Can you define what a construct is and
Yes.
how that differs from an item for
Oh.
myself and maybe some folks on the phone?
Sure. I'm going to give an example in a couple of minutes, but for example, one of the constructs we came up with was open communication. Part of inclusion is open communication, the degree to which people can really talk about what matters with each other and with their supervisor, with each other in a group, and so on, to the degree that they hear that from leaders to them too. So that's an example. A construct is something that we create to explain an idea. So inclusion is a construct, the experience of inclusion is a construct. Item is just a specific item in the questionnaire. I feel good here, right?
Yes.
Or I really like coming to this workplace. That's an item. But what is that measuring? That's the construct. Okay?
Gotcha. Thank
And
you.
I'm not going to do a statistical class here, but it's, when we talk about reliability and validity, it connects to these ideas. And the last part of this was that we wanted to discover what was driving inclusion, what predicted this index or this employee experience of inclusion, what were the behaviors and practices. So if you go to the next slide, you really see that virtuous cycle I talked about earlier was very much the basis for this model and this approach to measurement. What we found in our measures, for example, was that this experience of inclusion, we compared it. We had a 4-item index of the experience of inclusion, or an inclusion index as we called it, and we could compare across different groups. So we found that supervisors said they felt more included, people in the office versus those like in the production areas, those who completed the survey in Spanish, interestingly enough, and those who said that they were heterosexual. So you could take all the demographic and other items of all sorts and compare what the experiences of inclusion were. The other thing we did on the next slide is I mentioned the different type areas for inclusion. So we call them elements, and we had a number of items for each, and they're listed here on the right: collaboration and interdependence, fair and unbiased treatment, authenticity, leadership, open communication, support, trust from the team, trust in the supervisor, and work-life balance. Other organizations may have other ones, so these are not fixed, but they're very important and reflect the literature and the research. If we click, you'll see that then we also had different targets for rating those elements. So these were, in a sense, crossed with what it is that people were rating. So there were 4 items, as I mentioned, for the overall inclusion index. There were 12 items where people rated the behavior of their work group. So that's what I would call inclusive behavior at that next level of group. There's the people rated their supervisor's behavior. People rated their own behavior. And by the way, people who said that they were supervisors also rated themselves on those same supervisor behavior items. And I'll say more about that in a moment. People rated their own behavior, and they rated intergroup inclusion, like not just groups, social identity groups, but groups in the organization, like how different areas of the organization dealt with each other. And I mentioned the supervisor's self-evaluation. So these are the kinds of questions we could ask in this model, or things like what I said earlier. What's the overall experience of inclusion and how it varies based on different identities? We could ask, what are the drivers of the experience of inclusion? And from a technical perspective, what was the correlation of everything under the inclusion index and those items with the inclusion index? And then we could look at where the organization was in these different specific areas, like open communication or authenticity or supervisor behavior. Okay. So one interesting thing that we saw was basically how they were doing on these elements. And we could compare. We had in year 1 and in year 4, we could see that on the ones in blue, the amount of agreement went up. The ones that were gray stayed about the same. And we could see that also what percentage was there. And that's a judgment call within the organization, what's enough. A lot of times people ask for norms on these things, and that's nice, but I don't think that really tells you what you need to know. If you find that 90% of people feel that they could be authentic, in this case it was only 58%, but if 90% feel that, are you ready to have 10% of the people who are really not feeling okay at work? That's a huge waste of human capital. So I think that has to be a judgment call within each organization in terms of what the right level is. Another interesting thing we found with this data was what we call what maybe is a supervisor perception gap. Supervisors rated themselves on average on a 5-point scale as 4.41 on their own behaviors across 8 items in terms of how inclusive they were. So 95% or more within items said, yes, I behave inclusively always or frequently on this particular item. However, when people were asked to rate their supervisors, and unfortunately we couldn't match them specifically, but it's still, this is very telling, only 63 to 83% of the respondents rated their supervisor as inclusive on those same behaviors. And so there's a huge gap. And so what was interesting about this, it starts creating a really interesting conversation about why this is and what we can do about it. For example, one hypothesis I had was that supervisors are perfectly capable of being inclusive. In other words, I think they were being accurate. What they were not necessarily noticing was that maybe they weren't displaying those behaviors towards everybody in their group. And so yes, they were being frequently inclusive to somebody, or always inclusive to somebody. The question is, how widespread is that in the group? And this is where it gets very interesting. And this is where some of the work on bias or self-awareness and things like that, and also inclusive practices makes a difference. So this is how you would tie the measures and the results to the actual work within the organization in terms of creating change. We had a summit, if you will, with high leaders to analyze this. And so they had to work in groups to think about, what do you think is going on? What should we do about that? And to me, that's really the powerful piece of this, is what do we do with these data to foster more inclusion in ways that are real for the organization. And
to me, when I see this slide, I think that this further emphasizes when you were showing that visual earlier of the multi-systems approach, or what outlined we would call organizational support. I think that it emphasizes that you have to be thinking about measuring inclusion across the organization, and that it's important to hear from everyone. Another thing that I've been seeing is kind of this focus on training managers and leaders with inclusion, and there's been kind of this surge of inclusive leadership training. And I think that's another great step. I applaud every step, but I think that this, to me, signals that it's important to look at it from both sides. And across the organization. And that, like you mentioned, is what truly allows that action in those conversations around what do we do about this to be true and accurate and really lead to impact for your employees.
Think about what it's like to have inclusive leadership training or development in light of these kinds of data versus not having it, right? So the perceptions of the leaders are fine, but if they're faced with actual data from their people, now they're going to have to deal with that and try to make sense of it and think about, okay, how do we do even better?
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing that we did, and I mentioned this in one of the questions, is we looked at, and I decided not to show you the full regression. I'm just giving you the sort of simple summary. But basically, we looked for all the items that we had not in the inclusion index. We looked at which ones best predicted this overall inclusion index, the experience of inclusion. And we list the items here. Together, these items accounted for about 70% of the variance in the 4-item inclusion index. Or to put it another way, more simply, for every point that went up on these 5 items, for example, on the 5 items listed here, if those together went up a full point, let's say from sometimes to frequently, that's the kind of scale we had, then the overall index went up on average across all respondents by about 0.9 points. So it basically, these 5 areas capture so much about what really matters in terms of fostering inclusion. It's about fairness, it's about the work atmosphere and helping with the balance of work and outside work. It's about being able to speak up and really talk about what matters in ways that I don't have to just blend in. It's about really feeling valued and respected, not just as a person, but for one's ideas and contributions. And it's about feeling like the supervisor is fair and understands me and really builds me up, as opposed to having some kind of stereotypical view of me. This part here is not this organization. This is the assessment called the Inclusion at Work assessment, based on the building from the digital coaching platform and building on my research of many years, where we had a work group inclusion scale. And I've developed that further to create an Inclusion at Work assessment focused on the experience of inclusion and inclusive behavior, both self-rated, rating of supervisors, rating of one's work group, and also allows for adding some custom items. And so we have these 6 different areas in there: authenticity and voice, belonging and respect, fairness and equity as the key parts of the experience of inclusion. We have organizational commitment in terms of people's ratings of how committed the organization is to fostering inclusion. Inclusive supervision is people's ratings of their supervisor and inclusive behavior, and then people rate themselves on both inclusive behavior and their commitment to inclusion. And you can see here the type. Anyway, sorry about that. Technical stuff happens. I was talking about the inclusion at work assessment and its components, and talked about the 6 components, 3 for experience of inclusion, and 3 for the behaviors and practices of the organization, supervisors, and the self. If we click here, you can see there's a sample summary report. If we click again, it'll enlarge it, and you can see some examples of items within each of those sections and how it can be presented. That goes from agree to disagree, and we can summarize, and we can also highlight areas that seem to be strong and areas that seem to be less strong. So for example, in this particular sample, we have 188 people total. And I'm sorry, no, we have 200 something. You can't see the right edge, it's okay. But we have 81% of the people said that they agree or strongly agree that they're comfortable expressing their ideas and opinions to their colleagues. So that increases the mean for authenticity and voice. On the other hand, in terms of belonging and respect, almost 25% of respondents said that they often feel like an outsider at their organization. I think that's a lot. And so this is the kind of thing that one can analyze here. And you can see there's also the ratings of one's supervisor, and there's ratings of oneself as well. Only 52% of the people in this particular sample agreed or strongly agreed they seek out opportunities to work with people who are very different from themselves. So these provide a quick snapshot of areas to work on. I think Limeade has some things that it measures as well, right, Lauren?
Yeah, we do. And so when you were talking about constructs earlier, we talk about that in terms of drivers. We like to say it's the different kind of levers that you can pull to change that feeling of inclusion overall in your organization. So that's what you're seeing here, and I noticed a lot of similarities to what you were talking about earlier. Things like having a voice, so giving all of your employees a voice, not only in being able to vocalize who they are and share who they are, but also that their opinions are heard when making decisions about work. So what you're seeing here are different drivers of inclusion, or what Bernardo referred to as constructs. And then some sample questions that we ask in our Limeade inclusion survey underneath. We have multiple questions that measure each of these, and we have a 23-item inclusion survey. So we're always looking to kind of make it, we were talking about this earlier, break it down into where can I start? And I think when you look at it in terms of constructs or drivers, and you learn, okay, we need to focus on having a voice, or we need to focus on feelings of belonging, breaking it down into those more tangible things like constructs, like drivers, give a little bit more clarity into just where can you start with these efforts. And then I think having multiple ways to measure it underneath each construct and driver is important.
Thank you. I think that is so great, because what's really important here is that when you're going to measure inclusion, what I think the message is, you have to be really clear about what you mean. I think that's been what we've been driving home throughout this conversation, is what are really the components of inclusion that matter and that are going to support the overall goals. Why is inclusion important in your organization? What are the parts that matter? And then how will you specifically operationalize those, meaning how will you measure them? What does that look like in real practice? And what metrics are you going to use? And these scales and these items that Limeade has, or the ones I presented, give you a lens for thinking about that and for doing it yourself as well.
Yes, definitely. All right, so let's talk about some tangible ideas in our last couple minutes here before we turn it over to you for questions. So how can you present metrics to your executive team? So I've been in the position of having to pitch this idea to our executive leaders to bring them along the diversity and inclusion journey. And kind of my tips and tricks, and Bernardo, I'd love to hear yours as well, is of course, grounding your metrics and that story in business results, the mission, and the values. I think business results, we've seen so many stats around how things like diversity and inclusion connect to business results. And if you haven't seen those, I know Bernardo and I are happy to share those. We're going to send out our emails. Would love to have that conversation and make sure you have those resources. But also connecting it to your larger mission and the values at your organization is critical. I think connecting it to the numbers is really important, but those things like mission and values are really important for your employees. They want something that can align to and come to work and have meaning, and being able to look across not only the business results, but those really kind of higher level things are very important. Secondly, I always say using metrics is really important, those hard numbers, but when you can put stories behind it, that's where that power happens. That's where really you're going to mobilize people to action. So even if it's your own story, putting your own story behind one of those metrics around maybe people not feeling like they have a voice, finding stories of your colleagues who are brave enough to share those, but really making it real for people, and then combining it with the hard numbers, I believe is really what's going to create that movement in leaders. And then finally, making it personal to them. I think tapping into their own stories and their own feelings of this is a great tactic. But then also, I think when you're working with executive leaders, they want to build great companies, and they most likely want to be really great leaders. And thinking about how to build an inclusive organization is important to both of those things. Creating great companies are those that are inclusive, and great leaders, I believe, are ones that foster cultures of inclusion. So if you can connect to their own personal goals as leaders and business goals, I think that that's really important. Do you have any other thoughts around that, Bernardo?
Well, I love the bullets. I'm not sure we need to add anything, but just to expand on what you said, and you said it so well, is really connecting it to what matters in that particular organization. And I haven't met anyone yet who wants to be excluded. People have different degrees to which they want to open up, and that's fine, and people should be able to have certain zones of privacy. But people want to feel valued and like they matter and like they're maximizing their contributions in ways that are positive. And so being able to elaborate on what that actually looks like, as Lauren said, making it personal and telling stories, I think that's really the right way to go. In the assessments that I do, I really like to include space for comments as well as open-ended questions. I'm doing one right now for a client, for a national board of a national organization. And the comments are really powerful, really, really telling, and they help to explain what the ratings mean. And so that's going to really help when we have a gathering of the whole board to process all this, for them to see, okay, this is what we said, and kind of reflecting back a summary of the themes that come out, not just in the numbers, but in the stories.
Yeah, well, that's a great example. So what can you do to start measuring inclusion today? Obviously, we've talked about a lot. I just feel so grateful for Bernardo's insights today and his rich experience. But if I were to summarize it into kind of the 1, 2, 3, I think that really inclusion is an active process. We both talked about that with our definitions.
What are we doing
to
make it happen? What are we doing individually and collectively and systemically?
Yeah, and it happens every day and every moment. And so I think that what this signals is that you can't just measure inclusion once and then move on.
That's right.
It's an active process. It's constantly changing. So the more you can think about measuring inclusion more frequently to truly get at that, measuring it as an active process is key. Secondly, measuring inclusion is a powerful first action to take. You talked about it as an intervention. I think if you're wondering where to start, measurement, just giving yourself that benchmark. And then finally, I think this is connected to that as well, is that when you measure inclusion, it's not only educating your organization on the goal and the process, like we've been talking about, looking at those drivers gives a place to start, but it also allows you to know when you've made progress as an organization. And I think that that's a key in ensuring trust for your employees. When you can start making progress on inclusion and report back to your employees, that's going to ensure that they come back and continue to share those valuable insights with you. So
I love that. I think I want to get to questions, but what I was reflecting on as you were just describing these takeaways, I was thinking back to about 14, 15 years ago when I was first creating the workgroup inclusion measure with my students, and when I was teaching in the doctoral program, and we had about 900 plus people responding to this measure of the experience of inclusion and inclusive behavior, and people kept telling us that it helped them understand what inclusion was, that they hadn't thought about it that way. And so to me, that really drove home this idea that it's an educational tool as well as an assessment tool. It's both and it also signals to everyone that this is important for the organization. So I would encourage those of you who are measuring to continue doing it. Those of you who are not yet doing it to think about how you might do it in ways that make sense and are doable, and to keep learning about how it works and to share that learning with each other and with all of us in this field, because I think that's how we make it even better is through sharing.
Absolutely agree with that. All right, with that, let's use our last 10 minutes for some questions. So if you do have a question and haven't had a chance to type it in, go ahead and do so. And then we're happy to take as many as we can in the next 10 minutes, and then we can also always follow up if we miss a question.
Cool. So our first question is, have you worked with teams around measurement without surveying employees? Our leaders are sensitive to survey fatigue, so I want to find ways to start this work, keeping this in mind.
Ooh, that's a great one. You want to take it?
Sure. Yes. The answer is yes. I think I have, when I do workshops or retreats or whatever you want to call them, learning sessions, if we can do a survey, a mini survey for that group, it makes a huge difference, whether it's a leadership group or a board or a university department or whatever it is, right? So we don't necessarily have to do a organization-wide survey. We can use the same ideas and have 30 people or 50 people or 100 complete an assessment. I worked with one organization that was 60-some people, and then before we did the employee training for all of them, we did the survey, and then we reported that back, and we could see, we gave them information that really helped increase their motivation to learn and increase their interest in it, and really see themselves reflected in the data.
Mm-hmm.
So it provides a data-based way to work with teams, frankly.
Yeah, so breaking it down into smaller segments is definitely an option, and I hear you on this concern. I think that this is something I hear a lot and something we can relate to with that survey fatigue. One idea that actually I tried when I was first starting out diversity inclusion is focus groups, is having a more qualitative way of gathering information. So if you can't do a mass survey, how could you just bring together some people to start talking about inclusion? This is a great way to gather some of those stories we were talking about earlier. And then additionally, if there are any other data sources you do have, so if you have an annual engagement survey, I know that's still a survey, but if you don't want to add more onto that, is there data you can pull from that maybe aligns with some of these drivers we've been talking about, maybe measures around access to resources or having a voice? So I think, one, trying qualitative avenues like focus groups, and secondly, maybe trying to see what data already exists that you can pull from are great places to start if you can't do a wider survey.
Great. Another question that we just got, have either of you done anything in the area of increasing neurodiversity in organizations?
I haven't explicitly. I started being more aware of that as a really important area. I worked with one organization where one of the members of the DEI task force was on the autism spectrum, and he talked about it, and I had some great conversations with him about it, and I learned a lot from it. I hadn't really added it to the explicit work that we were doing. However, I think that doing an assessment of the kind we're talking about and including space for questions can allow for those voices to come in, because someone like this gentleman that was in this group was much more comfortable responding that way and really doing so in a profound way than speaking in the group meetings. And so it really makes you think about how are the different ways that people can speak up and tell you about their experience. And so that combination of different modalities it can be really powerful.
Yeah, and I love that somebody's asking that question.
Yes.
I think that that's fantastic and
Yes.
such a sign of progress and thinking about this in innovative new ways. So while I haven't done that work myself, I'm really eager to, and just really appreciate whoever asked that question.
Just want to call out, because it was Denise, and she said that they are doing a lot at neurodiversity at Atlas.
Yay. All
Good.
right, Denise, we're going to come find you and get your ideas.
Great. Our next question is, were there specific exercises, actions that helped bridge the gap between supervisors' self-ratings and how others rated them?
I think developing the awareness for supervisors about how to talk to people about the experience of inclusion. I think in a lot of my workshops, I do an activity where people share their experiences of inclusion, and also in many cases also share important identities to them. And I emphasize also the way to listen, which is not to judge, whether for good or for bad. And it's a very different way of hearing people when you're not trying to constantly compare or evaluate. And that's pretty powerful for people to do. I didn't get the chance to follow up with that particular organization over the longer term, but I think they continued to work with other folks on precisely those issues of developing the competencies, mindsets, behaviors that would have supervisors really open their hearts and minds to the different experiences and identities and behaviors that people bring, and to create that inclusive climate in their areas of responsibility.
Great. We have one gentleman who has 3 questions coming in back to back, so I'm just going to address them all. Dr. Ferdman, given that inclusion as decision-making is part of many conceptions of inclusion, I'm thinking Nishi, for example, in your mind, who are the most important people to see measurements of inclusion?
Okay, so let me see if I understand. The idea is, what was the first part? Given that what?
Inclusion in decision-making is part of many conceptions of inclusion.
Right. Oh, right. So I think that's an important point to highlight, and that goes back to what we said earlier, to really be clear about what conception we are using and how it relates to other possibilities. And so this gentleman mentioned Lisa Nishi, who does great work on inclusive climate. She's currently the Vice Provost of Undergraduate Education at Cornell, but has done some really great work. And so she's one of the folks who is really one of those go-to colleagues to talk about these issues. But she is looking at what's happening at the organizational and group level. That's what she calls an inclusive climate. What does it feel like in this particular sector of the organization, right? Anyway, I don't want to get into culture versus climate, but the idea is climate changes. Kind of like, there's sometimes it's stormy and sometimes it's sunny and sometimes it's raining. And so we want to understand both what are those dynamics and what provokes moving in different directions. But there are, sorry, my mind is blanking out right now, but there are other people. I mean, certainly Limeade has their work. I know that Beth Chung and her team, Lynn Shore and others have started to develop a measure as well that they've just published. And they're all kind of related in some ways. But I think a lit review will allow finding those, especially for the scholars in the group.
Great. We have time for one last question. How do you link between the ability to engage in conflicts as a learning experience and inclusion?
How do you link
between the ability to engage in conflicts as a learning experience and as inclusion?
That's a great question, because I think oftentimes people think that conflict is the opposite of inclusion, and I think it's part and parcel, as I said earlier when I talked about the paradox. And so I do workshops actually on conflict and voice, where that's exactly what I'm doing, is linking the two. And the way to link it is to understand that we have to speak up about things that matter. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And we may come up against things that are challenging and difficult. And so blending in is not the way to create inclusion. Inclusion is a way to create a space for many voices, even when they're discordant and divergent. And we need to think about how do we develop those skills to listen across those differences and therefore be better together with our differences. And so obviously we don't have time to get into the details of that, but hopefully that's enough. If I might take like a minute, go ahead.
I was just going to wrap this up. We are at time.
Oh, no, I just wanted to mention, I mentioned inclusion at work, and that is, I mentioned the digital coaching platform. And so there we also use it as a way to learn about inclusion. We have 4 assessments in there where people can learn about how they see their ideals of their own behavior, the others' behavior, the leader, the group, and their experience of inclusion, and how that compares to their actual. So that's another use for measurement, is for individual development. You can learn more at inclusionatwork.com.
Thank you both so much. I am so sorry for those who are still with us on the phone. We did have some technical difficulties today, so we will try to blend those 2 recordings together so that you can have that. We will follow up with an email this week with the contact information for both Bernardo and Lauren. Thank you both so much. And everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day.